First off, some common web pages that are good for historical cooking. I've got 4 of them listed. And then go over common spice recipes and just a handful of sauces just to get your appetites whetted for sauces. 4 of my favorite go-to web pages for everything from recipes to books themselves. You'll have medievalcookery.com, goodcookery.com, the Florigium, which is Stefan Ilrus's out of Onstiora. And then for ordering books, I'm not sure if anybody's ever been there, but prospectbooks.co.uk. Has anybody ever been there besides me? I'm taking that as a no.
No.
Okay.
Maybe.
It was started as an offshoot of a publication called Petit Propos Culinaire, which is I believe a quarterly magazine, or at least it used to be a quarterly magazine specifically for historical cooking, not just Middle Ages, but it also has Victorian, Georgian, Asian. It runs the gamut, and it has articles as well as books that are nothing but compiled articles from their annual seminars and whatnot. You can spend a lot of money really quick at that website. So it's one of those, if you're looking for keeping an eye on some of the newest publications, that's a good place to look at. I can't push that one enough. It's one of my favorite newer ones, especially I don't have to go through Amazon to get their markup to get the same book. Let's go with the common spice mixes. Today, when you go to the grocery store, you'll see the Italian spice mix, or you will see herbes de Provence, or you will see, the Cajun spice mix. Historically, in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, you had a lot of the same thing, and there were regional variances for many of them. Almond milk, not so much. You had one thing, almond and water, and it made milk. But there's always the, how would you say, the exception to the rule. I have seen some recipes, and I did not include it in here, but I've seen some where it calls for adding, instead of just hot water to the blanched almonds, the almond meal, I've seen where some adds in vegetable broth or meat broth or chicken broth to give that a more of a creamy taste or texture to the beverages before added to the items being cooked. But again, here's the most common one, is just take blanched almonds, and thank God for Bob's Red Mill. I no longer have to grind all my own frickin' almonds. We can purchase almond milk from the grocery store, but it does have some additives like carrageenan and other preservatives. So not knowing who has what allergies, I'd prefer to just go nuts and water and maybe a pinch of salt if necessary. But for the most part, it's just almonds and water. Now, the other 2 common spices that I wanted to go through, Padre Forte or strong powder, and Padre Doux or powder douce, depending upon how you want to pronounce it, and some of the variations there. Padre Forte or strong powder. Here's one recipe from a form of curry. This is the 1790 translation by Samuel Pegg. And it just basically clove, mace, cinnamon, grains of paradise, ginger, black pepper. And this was in the form of curry, their proportions. My main thing is play with it, taste it, see what you like and don't like about it, and add or subtract as you think prudent for the people you're cooking for or your own personal tastes. And that's one thing I will say about everything from the Middle Ages. Our taste buds haven't changed that much over the millennia. What has changed or modified is the cultural flavor palette. The Germans have a particular flavor palette. The Italians have a particular flavor palette. The Spaniards, the French, the Russians, the Middle Easterns, everybody has their own particular palate of what their foods tend to taste like. You know, when you walk into an Indian restaurant and you just smell that curry as you walk in, you know what to expect. Other countries and other regions are the same way.
Lady Yasha, formerly of Atenveldt, asks, grains of paradise?
Grains of paradise look like a miniature peppercorn, and personally to me, they have a very floral scent to them. I would highly recommend you get some and grind it up and play with it. There are plenty of recipes out there that have it in there, and I personally like it, and it's in my cupboard, and I use it, I won't say all the time, but I use it enough. That and cubeb are two of my favorite non-standard American spices that I tend to use. Another version here, this one's by Daniel Meyer off of the Medieval Cookery website that I mentioned earlier, and this is for his powder for it. It's ginger, cinnamon, clove, cubebs, grains of paradise, and black pepper. Cubebs, again, they sort of look like a slightly larger blackberry, a little bit larger than your average black pepper. This is another one I have a difficulty describing the flavor palette from. It's strong, but not peppery, a bit earthy. I don't know, it's one of those things that I know what it is, I know when to throw it in, but I can't really describe it personally. It's one of those things that always lives in my cupboard. And again, these are just two different versions of the powder four. If you go through the various, I think Menagerie, the Good Man of Paris has a version. A number of the various cookbooks throughout the ages have their own listing of ingredients. And these proportions are interpretations by other people on what they think it should be. So again, if you think it needs more cinnamon, or you think it needs more clove or more nutmeg, or not nutmeg, but grains of paradise or less, that is your prerogative as the cook to adjust it, because you are cooking this either for you, or if you are in the employ of a great lord, you are cooking for them. If they like it with more cinnamon, by God, you're going to give them more cinnamon. If they hate cinnamon, you're going to back it off. Now, going from the strong powder or the peppery powder, they have the poudre doux, or the fine/sweet powder. And I have a recipe in Danola that calls it Duke's powder. And I think that was, and other people have stated the same thing, that they believe that this was a misinterpretation of the term dolce, and turned it into El Duce, which is another word for Duke. So instead of Duke's powder, or I should say, instead of sweet powder, it became the Duke's powder. The other theory is, for that particular cookbook, there was a particular Duke that liked it above all else, and therefore we're going to name it the Duke's powder. Either way, it's more commonly known as fine or sweet powder. And again, for medieval cookery, and that should be deuce.
And there's a question in the chat: to do the recipe, what would you get from the store for it?
Oh, in exception for the cubebs?
Well, that and the grains of paradise. Like I usually make a lot of spice kits and like experimenting with recipes and stuff, and I've never heard of cubebs or grains of paradise before. So if I was to go to, say, like, I'm from Canada, so if I was to go to Bulk Barn or something like that, and look in their bulk section for spices, what would I look for?
I know I've seen grains of paradise in Sprouts. I have yet to see cubebs in Sprouts. I've also seen grains of paradise in Penzies. And there are places you can order online in bulk, but I'm trying to, if you can't find grains of paradise or cubebs, with grains of paradise, just remove it completely and go with the rest. And I have seen some versions of both poudre doux that don't have grains of paradise or cubebs listed in it. again, it's a regional variant, and not all places had access to all spices at all times.
Okay. Is there a substitution that you would put in to get the same kind of taste?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
I'm sorry, I have a soft voice. If you were to remove the cubebs and the grains of paradise, is there something else that you would put in to get the same kind of taste or reaction in the recipe?
I'm trying to think on that one.
I'm reading the Wikipedia entry on it right now. It says it's related to cardamom. Would that work?
Actually, yes, I think that would work in a small dose. I wouldn't overdo it with the cardamom. Maybe about half as much cardamom as the GOP. I've been very spoiled in my career of always having access to these at various places I've been at.
Yeah, in the States, if AJ's Fine Foods carries cubebs and grains of paradise, but you can
Yes,
also
they do.
you can order them from Penzies or Spice House.
Also,
Last time I checked with Penzies, they did not have cubebs. But the nice lady behind the counter is like, "What is this? I've never heard of it. I must get some." And then she immediately went to headquarters and started asking about it.
if you check the small ethnic stores up here in Canada, quite often they'll carry the ethnic spices.
Especially if you go into the Indian stores.
Yes, definitely that too. That's where I get most of mine.
And we have in Calgary, it's called the Silk Road. And they do mail orders all over Canada. And they carry both grains of paradise.
Okay, that's great because I'm in BC, so I don't think I've ever heard of Silk Road, so I'll probably have to order it online. Thank you so much.
So going back through here, again, this is an original or the original version, and then the translation by Janet Henson. And they're talking about white ginger. And I was having a discussion and a question with a colleague on this one, and we were thinking that the white ginger was trying to differentiate to make sure you weren't using galingal instead of white ginger, since the two roots do look similar. But I have seen some of the fine powders that use galingal as well as the ginger or in lieu of ginger. And again, if you have access to an Asian or Middle Eastern market, you might be able to get both fresh and ground or powdered galingal there. Another version here from Libra de Cocina. I believe this is Roberto de Nola's version. And then Mr. Selwise did the translation for this one. The sweet powder and the strong powder, these are two of the most common things you'll find in many recipes throughout the Western European areas. And I've got a couple of jars in my spice cupboard, and I will use them. I mean, I like the Padre Forte in my meatloaf, just whatever you like using it in. But again, it's just as much as someone using the Italian spice mix or the herbes de Provence or Cajun seasoning, barbecue rub. It all stems back from spice mixtures in the Middle Ages. And even the brewers had their own form of gruit, which was their flavoring spices that were used in beers. And going along with that, since we switched to alcoholic, spice wine mixes or epicris or whatnot. You'll find various versions of epicris, which just means spiced wine. And when I was living in Drachenwald, I got 3 different versions of this. I read through them, rewrote them, made a batch, and brought it out to a competition. And one of the German local nationals there brought a bottle of Glühwein, and they tasted mine, and then they went, "Here, try this." It tastes exactly like that. So I happened to recreate a modern German spice wine based on a 1,000-year-old recipe. So you can go to the, if you have no desire to make your own spice wine, just go to the liquor store, look for Glühwein, and have fun, because you know, it was very similar in flavor palette. But here we have a modern recipe for it, translated and interpreted from the Menagerie of Paris. Ginger, cinnamon, sugar, clove, nutmeg. This one up here also mentions galangal, which if you can't get access to galangal, ginger is a great substitute. A lot of recipes I just take as suggestions and then adjust for the palate and the mood that I'm in at the moment. Also think about what herbs are available or would be available to your persona and your area. I mean, cinnamon, that's imported from the Middle East because they have to wait for the rocks to uplift the trees that their nests are made of, and as it falls, that's when they gather it. At least that's what my spice merchant told me, which is why it was so expensive. Ginger and galangal can grow in most other areas, clove, nutmeg, but every homestead, every castle had a little herb garden somewhere, and they had a still room where they would take and dry the herbs, crush them, or leave them whole, and preserve them for later on in the winter when they didn't have access to fresh herbs because of the blanket of snow on the ground. Unless you live somewhere like Arizona, where it has, what, 3 or 4 growing seasons a year, and no snow in the southern regions. But yeah, I would encourage you, if you have not made your own Epicris, or spice mulled wine, Glühwein, give it a try and then play with the proportions, because you'll find it can be fun to try the different versions and pump up or drop down the various spice levels.
Someone asked in the chat, could we use the powder with grape juice to make a virgin Hippocras for a public feast?
I don't see why not. You know, yeah, go for it. Or another concept, one of the teas that I like to make is a hibiscus tea. If you're ever at any of the local Southwestern fast food Mexican drive-thrus, there's a beverage called Jamaica. It's deep red, it looks like a wine, it's high in vitamin C, and it tastes great. And you can take that and use the mulling spices in that. That would work very well. The next segue we're going to go into is mustard, because if you go through the drive-thru at McDonald's and you get your Chicky McNuggets, you're going to get offered sauces. You've got ketchup, you got honey mustard, you got barbecue, you got whatever. Well, mustard has been around for well over millennia, and Dijon, I think, was the first place licensed by the King of France to actually mass produce mustard with license. So, you know, that just proves how long it's been around and how good it's been. And this next section, the mustard 5 ways, this section was actually written by my student in Texas. And she went through and looked at different mustards. So let's just do a quick breeze through, starting with the Menagerie de Paris. Here again, I'm not going to insult you by reading it to you. I know you're capable of reading. Just looking at our notes here, the recipe is a lot of fun because it gives you different variations for the same recipe. You can use the sweet must or verjuice. And verjuice is basically an unripened grape must. And if you've been to the Middle Eastern markets, you should be able to find it there. I've actually seen it labeled as verjuice on one side. You flip the jar around and it says grape must. So, and there's a version with boiled verjuice, a version with cold vinegar. And if you don't have access to verjuice, you can use cold white wine vinegar or white wine vinegar cut half and half with water. Blend it into vinegar and then gently warm after with ground leftover spices, such as you strain out after you've spiced wine. So going back up to the Ipocris recipe above, you can take that, cut the recipe and use a smaller amount of that and throw that in with the mustard to get a spiced mustard. So going through her versions, if you want to keep the mustard a long time at wine harvest in a sweet must, again, mustard seeds, verjuice, a little black mustard seed, yellow mustard seed, and verjuice, salt to taste. And it doesn't say it up there, but I take that as an implied, because just having it by itself, to me, it needs just a pinch of salt to help open up the taste buds. And again, she mixed the ingredients together, let it get absorbed. And then I let it wait overnight and see how thick it is, and then maybe add more liquid as necessary. Or when you're mixing it, make sure it stays to a thin consistency, because it will absorb overnight and plump up and firm up. Her second version, which says it must be boiled, again, mustard seed and verjuice. Brought the verjuice to a boil, let it continue for about 3 minutes, pulled it from the heat, let it cool to a simmer, added the seeds until it was absorbed, let it cool before transferring it to an airtight storage container. And again, the next day it plumps up, but each one gives a different flavor profile. See, version 3. Make mustard hastily in a village. Grind mustard seed in a mortar, soak it in vinegar, and then strain. Mustard seeds, vinegar. And she did this with white wine over red wine because of what she had available in the kitchen at the time, like we do. Version 4, make it ready the sooner. The key phrases, put it in the pot in front of the fire, mustard seed vinegar. So again, you just put it together in front of the fire, or over a light simmer until all the liquid's absorbed, and then scroll down back into the corner of the stove while she cooked dinner. About half an hour by her gauge, and then cooled, transferred to an airtight container and stored. And then her last one, which is mustard seed, verjuice, or vinegar, cinnamon, clove, and nutmeg, basic mulling spices. And I love some of her descriptives. Once the wine was nice and yummy, I strained out the slightly exhausted spices. She ground them and then added them to the mustard. And again, a combination of yellow and black mustard seed. And again, going to personal taste, yellow mustard seed does have a different flavor than black mustard seed. I find the yellow mustard a lot more pungent than the black. I've had other people tell me they think the black is more pungent than the yellow. Anybody want to input on that one? If they've tried yellow or black?
It depends on where you get the black mustard from. I've had various varieties do different things. Sometimes it's more than yellow. Sometimes it's less than yellow and more like brown. So it all depends. And then you got the Chinese hots, which I also like to use.
Yes, that's one of my favorites. I am very lucky in the fact that I live less than a mile from an Asian grocery store, and I can get huge bags of mustard seed in the Indian section. And they've got both yellow and black. When I was living in Dallas, there was a Asian store that had ones labeled brown mustard seed as well. So again, it depends on where you're at and what you have access to grocery-wise. But mustard, I've always got a jar of homemade mustard in the fridge or in a jar on the counter, and it's one of the easiest things to make, and it is a a great gift at any time. It's something you can take with you to an event, and it's like, oh, look, here's roast beef. I've got some mustard. Because a lot of old songs from England's like, yes, the roast beef of old England with some mustard on the side and maybe a pickled onion. Yes, and thank you.
With the spice kits that I've done up as part of Large S, I actually get a lot of responses back, and I always include mustard and all these different ones, but I've researched like what spices existed during the Renaissance period, and I've gotten responses back because I've specifically put mustard in there, because some people don't expect it, and I'm like, no, it actually existed.
Oh yeah, and it keeps for a long time. The last time I taught a mustard class was in Texas, and one of the things I did, I brought out the basic ingredients and passed them all out, and had a mixing bowl in front of each person, and I had them make the mustard to their own taste. And by the time everybody was done tasting, I had rice crackers out just in case we had gluten-free issues, and I had people go around and everybody got to taste everybody else's mustard. And once they got tasted everybody's mustard, they said, okay, which one was your favorite mustard? And without exception, everybody pointed to somebody else's mustard and said, I really like theirs better than mine. And it just goes to personal taste. Impossible to tell which method is best. And I wholeheartedly agreed on this. This is a short version of the paper that she had for documentation for her mustard display in Onstiora. And as she said, they're all tasty. It depends on your personal taste. And that's the thing with anything you cook. When you are cooking for a crowd, you try to cook to the, sometimes, I don't want to say lowest common denominator, but the most common denominator of the average taste. And in this case with mustard, whether there are various ways to temper the mustard, because some people don't like dragon fire mustard. Personally, I love it. Other people don't. But again, it's something that's very easy to do, and hence the reason I have a grinder assigned just for mustard seeds. Now let's talk about sauces, because as I mentioned before, you know, you got roast beef, you can dip it in mustard, but what other things can you make? And I just grabbed a handful of various spices, spice mixes here. And the first one, a wine sauce for roast chicken. Because let's face it, if you're in need of a quick meal at an event and it's, you know, going to be a picnic thing, you swing by the store and you pick up a roast chicken. That way you don't have to cook it yourself. But one thing you could do is make a handful of, you know, a few little Tupperware containers worth of sauces, bring them, and then just have someone run to the store and grab you a chicken, and then just chop it up and start dipping and eating. So again, spiced wine sauce for a roast chicken. And again, I'm not going to bother reading this to you, but we'll look at the ingredients. Red wine, sugar, currants. I've had decent success getting Zant currants, which are close to European currants, but not quite, but are an acceptable substitute. I've been able to get these at Kroger's, Safeway, any of the major stores in the dried fruit section, along with the regular raisins or the golden raisins, dates, etc. Has anybody had issue not being able to, or have they bothered looking for currants in their average grocery store?
I've gotten them at a bulk barn before when I went looking for spices and whatnot, and I just kind of wandered around getting ideas of what I could actually get there. And I actually was quite surprised to find currants there.
Around the Meridian area, it seems like they're a seasonal thing, and you get them mostly at Christmas. I tend to stock up on them if I find them.
I'm sorry.
You can buy actual little red currant berries, proper currants, not the Zartan dried raisins, fresh currant berries on the East Coast during the winter.
There was a question of what is a penny worth?
A half penny worth butter. And that was denoting by weight, not by cost. Again, it's going to be playing with what you like based off of the recipe to see what you prefer. But going through it again, we got red wine, sugar, and currants, so it'll be sweet. Butter for your oil base, cinnamon, ginger, and breadcrumbs, and that's your thickener. In discussions with my student in Onstore, she is gluten-free, so we've been trying to modify things, and I'm trying to kick her in the butt to finish up her outline. She either wants to write an article for TI or for Complete Anachronist on modifying European or period recipes for the gluten intolerant. And the things that we've been substituting for breadcrumbs, everything from almond meal and some of the other grains that are gluten-free, and then describing what effect it has. Because breadcrumb will have a different effect than, say, if you're putting in plain flour. It thickens it up in a different way. I've been doing these for, 30 years now, and it's been an issue in the last 15 years with a lot more sensitivities and allergies in the SCA at these times. So for those of us that still enjoy doing feasts, having to modify them where the most common consumption has become interesting. Looking at all the variants that we can or can't use, and of course, isolating certain areas of the kitchen so that we ensure no cross-contamination. But going back to the recipe itself, let's see. Wine, sugar, and currants in a pot, bring to a simmer, remove from the heat, add breadcrumbs, add some chicken fat, or good Jewish schmaltz, as we call it, and remove it from the heat. Now, it doesn't say a thing here, if you go back to the original recipe, about whether you want to puree it or not. Because it takes good wine, sugar, raisins, remember that. Slices of white bread, lay them in a platter, lay the roast chicken on them. When the wine is well boiled with the sugar and the small raisins, take it from the fire, put in your butter, cinnamon, and powdered ginger, stir together, and pour it on the chicken. Now, my thought on this is I would want to, historically, have pushed this through a sieve to make it more fine. Because pouring this over the chicken, the currants aren't going to stick to it. But if you cook the currants until they rehydrate and basically burst, and then push that through a bit of a sieve to crush them up some more, or in modern terms, heat it up and then run it through a food processor, your good old Cuisinart for a few pulses, and then pour that over the chicken. That would get more of a sticky sauce that would stick to the outer skin of the chicken. Again, your mileage may vary. Not all cooks wrote everything down. They assumed that you as a cook would know certain things. It's up to question whether or not that's an implied or not. Cameline sauce, called for or called because that color was very similar to the tannish brown color of the camel. At least that was one of the references stated to me years ago. Whether that is true or not, I will not say, but that is one of the apocryphal stories for the name cameline, because it has a lot of cinnamon in it in a lot of versions that I've seen. This is out of form of curry, raisins of currants, kernels of nuts, crust of bread and powdered ginger, clove, flour of cinnamon, grind well together, salt it temper it with vinegar, and serve it forth. Now, this one does not mention heating it up, so this one is a cold-based sauce. And again, their proportions of rehydrated currants, pine nuts, breadcrumbs, ginger, cinnamon, clove, and vinegar. Here we say pine nuts. You could also use almond meal instead of the pine nuts. But it's, again, since they don't specify, depending upon where you're at, you could also use filberts or hazelnuts, because it just says kernels of nuts. It does not specify a particular one. Just know that each one has its own unique flavor. So you're going to soak your currants to rehydrate them, drain, add your nuts, breadcrumbs, and spices. And here he's already mentioned food processor. Pulse to combine, add the currants. Slow drizzle the vinegar into it with the processor running. And the key thing here is letting it set for at least an hour or so to absorb your liquid, because even after you've pulsed it and pureed it, it still has time to plump up. And after an hour, it could become a thick paste more so than a thin sauce. And again, when you're using this sauce or a dipping sauce or to baste onto something, the thickness will be more dependent on what you're using it for. If it's a dipping sauce for ripped up meats, you're going to want it to be a bit thinner. If you're going to be basting it onto say a chicken or game hens or quail to roast over the fire, you're going to want it a lot more thick to adhere to your item of conveyance, whether it's a game hen or a quail. And again, cameline is one of the more common sauces that you'll find. And I could have inundated you with 6 to 8 different versions of cameline sauce, depending upon which cookbook, whether it's Platina or Libra de Cocina, form of curry, and or Mark Rumpolt's Einenoi cookbook. They all have a cameline sauce in there, and they're all slightly different. And as you can see, this is a more sweet and tart, because you got the sweetness from the currants, the sharpness from the ginger, and the tartness from the vinegar.
One question is:
Yes.
Is the goal with this sauce and the others to have a smooth consistency, or would it be all right to have a chunky or chutney style texture?
And that goes back to the statement I made earlier of who are you cooking for and what is their palate. I have some friends that do not like chunky at all, and I've got other friends that really prefer to have texture in their food. So that goes to who are you cooking it for and what is their preference. I will go back to my days as a non-Laurel entering an arts and science competition. I would tell the judges, like, look, this is not for me. This is for X, Y, and Z. They preferred it this way, therefore I cooked it this way. Or I did a test run in my kitchen. I gave it to these people. I gave a chunky one, I gave a smooth one, and I had a semi-chunky one. Of those 3, they preferred X, Y, or Z. Therefore, that is what I made for competition. And I've also done a competition where I've had it done 3 different ways and say, these are the same items done in different, using the same recipe, made 3 different ways. What do you think? Which I usually get better feedback when I've done it 3 different ways and showed that the science of the kitchen can be very different. The answer is, what do you prefer? Or what is the use it's going to be? As I said earlier, if you're making something for a dipping sauce, you may want it thinner and smoother. If you're using it as a baste to brush on something you're roasting, like again, a chicken or something, you're going to want it thicker, but will you also want it chunkier or smoother? I've got a fairly decent sized cookbook collection, and going back to the Florigium website, there is a section in the Florigium, under the Florigium, that has cookbooks. There are some people that have translated some of the cookbooks and uploaded them to the website, and you can take those, download them, and put them in your own hard-covered collection. The two of the favorites that I've got out of there, one was Das Kochbuch von Sabine Westerlin, which is, I believe, a 15th century German cookbook. And there is Roberta de Nola's Libro de Cocina, Spanish, 1520-ish. And they're out for public domain. So if you want to just download them and keep them for yourself. It looks like we're almost out of time.
Well, thank you for a really wonderful class.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're making me excited to try these things.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much.